Svein Tore Holsether, thank you so much for joining the NABA Perspectives podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you on.
Well, thanks for having me.
Right. You're the CEO of Yara. Yara in Norway is a household name. Of course, your business is agriculture. But for people who are watching this who might not be that familiar with Yara and might not be that familiar with your work across Africa, maybe it's a good idea to just start with a very quick summary of what you do on the continent.
Sure, and I think in order to explain what we are today, I need to talk about how we started as a company, and that takes us 120 years back in history, and at a time where agriculture was struggling to keep pace with the population growth. You have the Industrial Revolution, growing population, and farmers were struggling to maintain productivity. And the reason for that is that, with a higher population, you needed to farm more food. And when you farm and you take the crops away from the field, you also remove nutrients. And they were not able to regenerate that by itself. So you needed to add nutrients back. And the most important nutrient is nitrogen. And even though the air that you and I breathe is 78% nitrogen, it's not available to plants from the air. They need it in fixed form through fertilizer. And that was the big challenge going out throughout the whole world. How do you harness the nitrogen from the air and turn it into fertilizer? And that breakthrough innovation was done at the University of Oslo with Professor Birkeland, that's founded our company together with Sam Eide and with support from the Wallenberg family. And today, mineral fertilizer feeds half of the world's population. Half of the food is a direct result of fertilizer, and that's the very start of our company. We believe, and not only us, but the Norwegian population did a popular vote some years ago on what is the most important innovation in Norway of all time. Well, mineral fertilizer, and it was relevant then. It's still relevant today throughout the world as we're facing challenges both on feeding the world, but also doing that in a sustainable way. And that is the DNA of our company very much today as well. But it dates back to 1905 with the start of our company.
Fantastic. And where does Africa fit into this for you?
Well, it fits perfectly, I would say, because when you look at population growth in the world today, where do you see the strongest population growth at the moment? How do you see that going forward? Africa is in the center of it, but also in terms of food production and both for food security, but also as a business. And when you look at the arable land in Africa, obviously it's very suitable for agribusiness. But at the same time, we need to tackle the challenge of hunger, of nutrition, getting the right nutrients in there, but also now the climate challenge. We have a vast opportunity, but also we need to make sure that we get this done in the right way. But right now, one of the big challenges that the world is facing, that Africa is facing, is that instead of Africa being a breadbasket to the rest of the world with huge export revenues, it's actually a huge import bill of food going into Africa. And that's money being sent outside Africa that should be spent in Africa and ideally creating income. So that's how I think it fits in very well, that we need to have a more productive and more sustainable agriculture sector in Africa.
Absolutely. Now, there's a lot to unpack in that already, and maybe we can delve a little bit deeper into some of the points you've raised. So, the potential for agriculture and for food production in Africa is well known. 60% of the uncultivated arable land in the world is on the continent. Tremendous potential, but as you've already alluded to, it's proven to be easier said than done to realize that potential. Now, one of the big themes that's emerged in recent years, and Yara, of course, has been a prominent voice for some time in terms of driving the agriculture agenda and driving the development of the sector on the continent, is this question of food systems and food systems transformation. Now, in simple terms, what we're talking about here is the entire picture of, I guess, what you could call the value chain or the supply chain of agriculture, from production to processing to consumption to waste management to distribution and all of these things. But if we sort of just start at a high level, how have you seen the conversation around the question of food systems, around the question of developing Africa's agriculture sector develop over the last decade or so? Because we've kind of had some ups and downs, where at the start of the last decade, there was a lot of optimism, there was a lot of energy behind the idea that, we might be on the cusp of a breakthrough here. But it's proven to be harder to do and maybe easier to say.
Well, it is hard, but so we can't have that as a reason not to go full speed ahead on this. And this is something that we've been working on from Yara side for a very long time, and together with the African leaders, with the Africa Food Systems Forum, and how that all started. It's a direct result of call to action by then Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, that wanted a green revolution in Africa. And here systems thinking is a key part of this, because we're at a point in time, both in Africa but also globally, where no single player can do this alone. There's no company, there's no organization, there's no university, there's no government, there's no NGO that can do this alone. It's about the systems thinking around it. But systems is inherently challenging because it's a different way of working. You need to work throughout whole value chains, and we're trained in a way to optimize our own organizations from the business side. We think about our own P&L and balance sheet. That's only going to take us so far. We need to think about the totality of everything that we're doing, and then systems thinking is key. Thinking all the way from the upstream part of the business to the downstream part of it, getting governments involved, financing involved, to think about the totality of this, and that's where I think the systems thinking is key. And I was fortunate enough that just 3 weeks after I started my job in Yara, and I came from outside the ag industry, so this was one of my first introductions to the industry. So I started in September of 2015, and 3 weeks after, I was in Lusaka for the Africa Food Systems Forum, and AGRF as it was called at the time. And then I was fortunate to meet very early in my time here Agnes Kalibata. I met Strai Masayiva at the time, and I had some really interesting conversations, and that was really my first introduction into African agriculture, both when it comes to the challenges, but also in terms of opportunities. And that's how we've shaped our work and continued the work from the Yara side on this. We were part of the start of this very forum, and then I think we go back to 2005, 2006. And we're still very much engaged. It has evolved a lot from first being a main focus on productivity. It's a much broader discussion right now. It's about the climate emergency. It's about food security. It's about the destruction of biodiversity. It's about soil degradation. All of these elements play an important role, and because of that, there are no quick fixes here. It is complicated. It will be complicated, but so is the upside. And I believe that this is one of the big business opportunities of our time, to think about African agriculture, but also from a climate perspective, and also from a food security perspective. And then when I say food security, I'm not only talking about Africa. I'm thinking about the whole world. Because in the pandemic, we saw the impact of how vulnerable the global food system is, how complex the trade flows are. and we see that food is traveling in a way too much. How can we grow food in more places? We see the climate impact of food, and with extreme weather events that we thought it happens once every century or every decade, seems to be happening on an annual basis now. And then we have the geopolitical part of this as well, and where we see the importance of food, and that how that is also being used as a weapon in war. In fact, the World Food Program won the Nobel Peace Prize because food, or rather lack of food, can be used as a weapon in war. So it's very complicated, but that's why it's important that we all engage and take an active role in this. And here the African Food Systems Forum has an important role, and it is a huge convener of people and organizations in order to discuss and drive this the way forward.
Do you think that some of the factors that you've just listed, and I think this is a critical point when it comes to the conversation around where the sector goes in Africa. We had the pandemic. We know that climate change and sustainability have become a very pressing issue. It's not a conceptual or theoretical conversation anymore, particularly when it comes to food production and, of course, the geopolitical impact. I think it's fair to say we've had quite a few shocks to the system, so to speak. Do you think that has kind of woken people up in a way, or maybe sort of increased the sense of urgency behind addressing some of the bottlenecks that we've seen to agricultural development in Africa? Because in the wake of the pandemic, there has been some rhetoric, there's been some talk around, okay, this is the moment when we need to stop importing food. We need to start actually producing food on the continent. Has that shifted the needle in any meaningful way from what you've seen and from the conversations that you're having?
I think so. And the position of food, and how important that is, and how it's being talked about, whether it's in media or at the United Nations General Assembly and other forums. I think it has now come to a place where it's more discussed, and where there's a greater awareness. And we've had some wake-up calls, and even parts of the world that thought it was, say, past the point of having to think about food security, has, even though it was for a brief moment, at least been exposed to having to think about food as well in the very initial stages. And it's far, it seems such a distant memory now. But even in the country where I'm sitting in right now, my local supermarket ran out of quite a bit of food items in the beginning of the pandemic. And, not a big deal here. It was fixed, but it was a bit of a wake-up call that it can happen even at this day and age, that you face food insecurity. Now, both Europe and many other parts of the world were able to deal with it quite quickly, so that that wasn't a concern. But it came at the expense of others, and that's something that I think we need to be aware of. In a global auction for food, which we could call it, then the strongest economies have a very strong buying power, and they were able to secure food. But what did we do? What did we see? Well, we saw a huge spike in food prices, both throughout the pandemic, but also now after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the impact that has had to the food system. We saw a spike in food prices, and that was in parts of the world an inconvenience. Food became more expensive. Those are the fortunate ones. For others, it's been a question of whether you have food or not. It's about famine, and and death because of that. It's about malnutrition, and that's something that we all need to be aware of. And where I do think that the awareness is greater. Look at the headlines of major news outlets in the last few years. Food has come at a higher point on the agenda. Now, we're still faced with a lot of this. Even if food prices have come down, a lot of the challenges to the food system are still there. And now, as Europe and the US has battled inflation with higher interest rates, uh, that has consequences in other parts of the world. You see, with higher interest rates, the currencies have strengthened as well. Look at the euro, look at the US dollar compared to a lot of the African currencies, and they have weakened, right? So that means a higher food bill in local terms. It means higher financing cost for farmers. So this is not over yet. We need to continue this focus, but uh, we all have a role to play here. But I do believe actually that food has um, uh, changed its position. So let's utilize that now to drive the food system in the right direction, both from a climate perspective, from a food security perspective, but also from a business perspective for African farmers.
First of all, I think such an important message. This problem hasn't gone away, far from it. And when you look at the indicators and the data across Africa, we've actually seen a deterioration in food security in much of the continent, which just underlines the importance of doing something about this. And I think you've provided the perfect segue, because we've set the scene. We've spoken very much about the big picture and the context. The question, of course, then becomes, well, how? How do we now go about this? This is when it gets tricky. And rather than, I'm not going to ask you to sort of address the whole of that, because it's too broad, but you are ultimately, you are a business, and you are in the business of agribusiness. So the private sector, it's long been sort of acknowledged that the private sector has an important role to play here, not least because financing and funding has long been a real struggle for the agriculture sector across Africa. And the only entity or the only space that can realistically step into that is the private sector. So from that perspective, from the business perspective, and you've made the point that this is a huge opportunity, not just in terms of food security, but also from the business side. Where do you see some of the biggest difficulties, but also some of the opportunities to take practical steps here?
Yeah, you're right. If we were to try to go through everything right now, we would need days rather than minutes, right? So let me try to focus on, where can we make a difference, and how can we work in partnerships to make a difference. And for us, from Yara, the answer to an important part of this is actually in the soil. How do we make sure that we have a soil that is healthy? Because if you have a healthy soil, you will have healthy crops and you will have high yields. And this is something that we're working hard on, but we're still, not breaking through to the extent that I would have liked to. And plants are like us humans as well. They need a balanced diet in order to grow and to be healthy. And if I told you that from now on your diet would consist of, one, maybe two or three nutrients, you would survive. You wouldn't be very healthy, maybe not even survive in the long term, but it would have a detrimental impact to us as humans. So why do we approach plant nutrition in that way, that you just add one or two nutrients? It's about balancing that, making sure that we add back the nutrients that we take out of the soil. And when we get that focus, and I've seen it firsthand myself. I was it's not that long ago. I was in Kenya, in the countryside outside Nairobi, and I saw farmers that were given the right input and the right knowledge about which nutrients to put back into the soil, and how they faced both productivity and yields and higher crops, but that very region was also subject to extreme weather. First drought, and then heavy rain, and then I could see the difference between parts of the land that had healthy soil, how much better that soil is able to withstand the extreme weather than the one that was not, where the soil was not healthy, the nutrients were washed away, and the yields, crop yields, went down significantly. So by focusing on soil and soil health, so that's about measuring, making sure that we understand the soil, making sure that we have incentives driving soil health, making the products available, the advice, helping with the weather applications and so on to support that. But also here we need an enabling framework, so that whether it's subsidies or incentives for the farmers, so that they are, putting not putting all the burdens on the shoulders of the farmers, and then on top of it, we need finance as well. But if we sort of build that uh, ecosystem around soil health, we get so many of the other parts for free. It's in a way simple, but yet
Yeah.
extremely challenging, because it's something that involves so many players at the same time. But if you put the farmer in the center and help the farmer so she or he can ensure that you have the right soil conditions, then a lot of it comes in place. And that's how it also connects with our business, because if we go back, like I explained, the start of our company 120 years ago, it was really about helping the farmers to get nutrients back into the soil to enable sustainable and high productivity.
Yeah. You touched on the complexity of the different players that need to come into this. On the question of partnership, what are some of the key elements there? Where are some of the key partners? Obviously, governments and policymakers, but in the wider ecosystem, who else needs to sort of step up here or get involved to really make things happen?
Well, I think it's an obligation on all of us to work on this, because let's say that we're successful in the upstream and helping the farmers, and we see, and I've seen this as well. We get higher yields. The farmer has a bigger crop. Okay, but if that doesn't reach the market, or there is no market for it,
Mhm.
how do you make sure that you have storage in place to enable it? How do you make sure that you have infrastructure in place? Or if yields are lower, or you have higher prices, how do you make sure that also higher prices is something that the farmers benefit from? Because in many ways, the cure for high prices is really high prices, right? But if then artificial measures are put in place so that the farmers don't have the upside but only the downside, well, then that is a challenge as well. It's about also the buying patterns, making sure that we're linking in with the major food companies, so that they also take an active ownership of what is happening in the field of the farmers, and ensuring predictability, so that if you farm in a certain way, where you're taking care of soil health, where you're reducing emissions, is there a market for that, so that there's some premium in place to ensure sustainability as well. Then it's on the supermarkets. Then it's on the consumers. How do we send that message to the supermarkets and the food companies, so we can transfer that back into the whole value chain? It's about financing as well, and this is a big challenge, and one that's become increasingly challenging in Africa in the last couple of years, with deteriorating currencies, on high interest rates, availability of financing for smallholder farmers. How do we make sure that's in place? And then we have the governments as well. How are agricultural subsidies and support mechanisms put in place? How do we ensure that it reaches the farmers? How do we ensure that it drives the right practices? That's also an important component. And then we have the international aid as well, that we have to also make sure that that is driving productivity, that it's a path towards creating businesses, that we should think about farmers as entrepreneurs, so that we drive this in the direction of, as I mentioned, creating businesses and not creating dependencies. Because if you create dependencies on continued support, well, that's what you're getting, rather than driving it in the right direction. It's incredibly complex. It's a different way of working, where we need to be transparent, where trust is part of this, or not only part. It's essential, because if you don't have trust, how do you then create openness around this, in order to drive this transition? But if we get it right, the reward will be big.
Yeah. And I think that just underlines the whole need to think in terms of food systems
Yeah.
rather than just production. And I'm glad that you included in your comments just now things like the infrastructure, things like food storage, because that immediately brings in questions of energy, right? Questions of logistics and transportation. Like these things don't happen in a vacuum. And yes, complex, but it can, of course, be done. But before we sort of wrap up, and to wrap up, I'd like to get your thoughts on where we go next. But one area where there's been some discussion in recent years is the role of technology in this, particularly this idea of agri-tech. We all know that we live in a digital world. An increasingly digitalized world. Apparently, the robots are going to take over very soon. And it seems these days there's an app for everything, right? There's a platform for everything. What's your take, sort of briefly, on agri-tech and its role when it comes to African agriculture in particular? Because we've seen funding going into the sector go up in recent years. Is it, how excited should we be, or, where's a note of caution maybe around this question of agri-tech?
We should be very excited, because technology is a huge enabler of this. And this dates back to one of my very first conversations with Strive Masiyiwa. We were talking about technology, the promise of technology, and he built his business on technology, right? And he saw, well, I guess more people saw the potential for mobile phones in Africa. It's just he saw it clearer than everyone else, and even he was wrong in terms of how fast it would grow. But it's the same thing on agriculture. And then we were discussing, how do we get young people into agriculture, because they are going to be the key drivers in implementing technology into agriculture. And it isn't, or agriculture isn't this old-fashioned view on very hard, manual labor out in the fields. You can do tremendous improvements with the use of technology. So then how do we engage? And that was the start of what is now the Go-Getters, or the Generation Africa, which is a competition that we put in place in order to highlight African entrepreneurs that want to create businesses around the African food system, that see that opportunity, and it's gathering a lot of attention. And when I listen to the pitches that these entrepreneurs are driving, and I know Strive is equally excited about this as I am, that's really cool to see. And the ideas that they're coming up with, the businesses that they drive, are just amazing. And when you think about it, the ingenuity and the drive and the creativity of the African people, and of the young African entrepreneurs here, you will see significant businesses being built here. And when you're building on top of a natural advantage that Africa has in agriculture, these could be future unicorns. It will not only for Africa, but for the rest of the world. And where you see you can skip certain steps in the development of the agriculture sector, but technology will help on this. And you see it, whether it's with digital imagery to track the the nutrition that the soil needs, extremely precise weather apps. You can put in the palm of the farmer now technology that used to be only available to huge industrial scale farming just a few years ago. Now farmers can get access to that. So here I think Africa will play an important role, not only for Africa but for the rest of the world to drive this. But I'm a huge believer in technology. That's how our company started back in time, and it's very much part of our DNA today. And we're very excited to work in Africa and other places to help to support this.
And what, of course, immediately comes to mind is mobile money in Africa. And I'm not making a comparison between agriculture and mobile money, but it's a good illustration of how you can revolutionize a sector and basically just kind of skip those steps, as you said. Now, final question, and it's going to be another one of these big open-ended ones, but I'd just like to get your perspectives on where you see this conversation and some of the realities around the sector going in the next few years. Now, I know it's always tricky to make predictions about the future, and I would say it's more tricky than ever in the world that we live in at the moment. So, we won't hold you to any of this, but maybe some in a sort of at a high level, where do you see this whole debate and the realities of food production and food systems in Africa going over the next few years?
Well, I think we're at a crucial point in time, not only for Africa but for the whole world. 25 to 30% of greenhouse gas emissions come from the food system. So unless we get food right, we're not going to be able to reach the target in the Paris Agreement. If we don't reach the Paris Agreement, well, we see what is happening to weather and extreme events throughout the world. So it's connected in a way. That is becoming more and more visible now, and I see the start of this now, that it's changing agriculture and how we think about it. We need to embed, as we already talked about, on technology. Technology is going to be a key driver in enabling first the visualization of this, but also to come up with data-driven ways of managing this, and where soil health and the right nutrition is into the soil is going to be key. So we're much more precise on it. Then we need, it's a growing population throughout the world, in Africa in particular. That is also, because of that, we need to grow more food. More food should be grown locally, and it can be. I think you mentioned it as well, that 60% of the uncultivated arable land is in Africa. That is an important part to both feed the growing population, but also feed other parts of the world. And Africa has an important role to play here, and that is about a more distributed food production system, so that we're better able to withstand shocks to the system, whether it is from climate or geopolitics, or if we will get a new pandemic. We need to be more robust. We've had some learnings here. And then it's about a key part here is that we need to think about agriculture as a business, a key driver for wealth generation, for employment, and that to build technology on top of that. That's a huge opportunity. But we need to have an enabling environment for that, so that we don't think about agriculture just with the food security lens. It needs to be with a business lens as well, and that will drive creativity. It will drive entrepreneurship, and it will drive job creation. And no place in the world is more exciting when it comes to this than Africa. But then we need to have all these thoughts in our head at the same time, and that is a challenge, but also hugely interesting, and it's a huge opportunity.
And fundamentally important, as I think you've just very eloquently outlined. If we don't fix food, we can't address the climate. If we don't address the climate, well, we don't want to go there. End of story. And Africa, one way or the other, has a pivotal role to play in that. Svein Tore, thank you so much for the discussion. It's been fascinating. As you said, we could go on for days, but we don't have the time, and you need to get back to working on those food systems. Thanks so much for being on the podcast. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for having me.